off. This is San Francisco, California, back in March of 1900. There it is. San Francisco, California in 1900, and to be specific, this is Chinatown in San Francisco. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see that there is a barbed wire that's stretched down the street. It's like a fence, a barbed wire fence that's essentially separating those storefronts and those homes from the main street. And the reason that barbed wire fence is there is because back then, Chinatown was quarantined. It was cut off from the rest of the city. It was isolated from the rest of the city. The rest of San Francisco didn't want anything to do with the immigrants who lived there, so they didn't have anything to do with the immigrants who lived there. And even before Chinatown was quarantined, there was already a huge backlash going on against the Chinese people who were immigrating to the United States. There was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically ended Chinese immigration for 10 years, prohibited Chinese people from becoming U.S. citizens. That was passed by Congress. That was signed into law by then-President Chester Alan Arthur. There was a general sentiment back then that Chinese Americans were taking over the country. There were too many of them. And there was also a strong sense that they were the source of terrible diseases like leprosy and smallpox, you name it. And a Chinese man was suspected of maybe having died of the bubonic plague in Chinatown in San Francisco. Well, then that took everything to a whole different level. That was when they decided to cordon off Chinatown from the rest of the city. No Chinese Americans were allowed to leave that area. They were locked in. Of course, that only fueled the idea that Chinese Americans as a whole, as an immigrant group, were carriers of disease. That was back in the early 90s.